Viktor was ecstatic. After decades of Soviet rule, Ukraine was finally free. He imagined a future filled with possibilities, a future where Ukrainians could shape their own destiny. But the reality was far more complex. The giant had fallen, but the aftershocks were still being felt. The economy was in shambles, jobs were scarce, and prices were skyrocketing. Viktor watched his parents struggle to make ends meet. The optimism of those early days began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. The country was deeply divided. Some wanted to embrace Russia, their historical ally. Others longed for a future in Europe, a future of democracy and prosperity. The arguments raged on, fueled by fear and uncertainty. Viktor just wanted a normal life, a chance to build a future for himself and his family. But the path forward seemed shrouded in fog. The 2004 presidential election, specifically held on November 21st, 2004, felt like a final straw. After years of struggling, Ukrainians wanted a leader they could trust. But the results were wrong. Everyone knew it. The official count didn't match what people saw with their own eyes. It was like someone had changed the rules of the game at the last minute. Viktor felt a surge of anger, a sense of being cheated. He couldn't stay home. He had to do something. He joined the thousands of others heading to Independence Square. The air was thick with anger, but also with a strange sense of hope. People were wearing orange, a color that suddenly meant defiance, unity. For days and nights, the square became a city within a city. People spoke their minds, demanded change. Viktor felt a sense of belonging he'd never felt before. It wasn't just about the election anymore. It was about taking control of their own destiny. It was like they were saying, "We are a nation, and we will decide our future." And their voices were heard. The Supreme Court declared the election results invalid, ordering a rerun. It was a victory, a moment of hope, a step towards a fairer Ukraine. But the bear didn't like it. The bear saw people standing up for themselves, and it growled. It saw Ukrainians daring to dream of a different future, and it felt threatened. The afterglow of the Orange Revolution was fading. The West was offering words of support, promises of closer ties. But the bear was sending a different message, a message Viktor couldn't ignore. He saw it on the news. NATO, the Western military alliance, was expanding. More and more countries were joining, getting closer to Ukraine's borders. It was like the West was saying, "We'll be your friends, we'll protect you." But the bear was saying, "If you get too close to them, I'll be angry." And the bear had ways of showing its anger. Viktor heard about gas disputes, how Russia could turn off the taps, leaving Ukraine and even parts of Europe in the cold. It was like the bear was saying, "Remember who you depend on." Viktor heard whispers about Ukraine joining NATO. The West encouraged it, but the bear made it clear that was a line Ukraine couldn't cross. The promise of freedom, the dream of a truly independent Ukraine, was starting to feel like a distant memory. Viktor started to worry. The feeling of being trapped, of being watched, was growing stronger. And Viktor knew deep down that the bear was preparing to make its move. Then, the unthinkable happened. The bear showed its teeth, and the first bite was deep. February 27th, 2014, Viktor was scrolling through his phone, and the images he saw didn't make sense. Soldiers, but without any flags, no insignia, just soldiers. They were taking over key buildings, the Crimean Parliament, the Simferopol airport. They were moving like ghosts, swift and silent. It was like a scene from a bad dream, a nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. Crimea, a place Viktor had visited as a child, was being seized, and no one seemed to know who these soldiers were. The Russian military helicopters flying overhead, while denied by Russia, told a different story. On March 16, 2014, a referendum was held, but it felt like a sham. People were forced to vote under the watchful eyes of these unknown soldiers. It wasn't a choice, it was a forced surrender. And then, on March 18, 2014, just like that, Crimea was gone. It was like the bear was saying, "I'm taking this back. You have no say in the matter." Victor was in shock. How could this happen? How could a part of his country just vanish? It was a brutal wake-up call, a stark reminder of Ukraine's vulnerability. After Crimea, the bear didn't stop. By April 2014, it moved east, into the Donbass region. And there, the real nightmare began. It wasn't just soldiers anymore. It was neighbors fighting neighbors, brothers turning against brothers. It was a war that tore families apart, shattered communities, and turned cities into ruins. Victor watched the news, his heart sinking with every image, every report. It was like watching his country bleed slowly and painfully. From mid-2014 through 2015, major battles raged, including the battles for Donetsk Airport and Debaltsev. Homes were reduced to rubble, schools, hospitals, everything was destroyed. People fled, leaving behind everything they knew, their entire lives packed into suitcases. People talked about peace, about ceasefires, about agreements, like the Minsk agreements of September 2014 and February 2015. But they were just words, empty promises. The fighting never truly stopped. And Victor felt like he was living in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He was waiting, always waiting, for the next explosion, the next attack, the next wave of grief. The war in the East was a constant wound, but beginning in spring 2021, the bear was preparing to deliver a killing blow. By late October and November 2021, more and more soldiers, tanks, and weapons were being moved to the border. It wasn't just a few troops anymore. It was a massive army, a force that could swallow Ukraine whole. Fear gripped the country. Throughout December 2021 and January 2022, diplomatic efforts intensified, but the bear's military buildup continued unabated. Everyone was scared, not just in the East, but everywhere. Would the West finally step in? Would they keep their promises? Or would they just watch as Ukraine was devoured? Victor didn't know. Nobody knew. It felt like the promise of freedom. The dream of an independent Ukraine was about to shatter completely. The tension was unbearable. By mid-February 2022, the warnings from Western intelligence became increasingly dire, with specific dates for a potential invasion being circulated. It was like waiting for a storm, knowing it was coming, but not knowing when it would strike. And to understand why this was happening, you need to see what happened next. On February 24th, 2022, the nightmare became reality. The bear attacked, unleashing a fury that shook the world. Missiles rained down on cities, tanks rolled across the border, and the ground trembled with the force of the invasion. Victor, like millions of Ukrainians, was plunged into a war he never wanted, and it was a bitter irony. Years before, in the 1990s, specifically after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine had possessed the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. But believing in a peaceful future, trusting in promises from Russia and the West, they surrendered those weapons. They were told their sovereignty would be respected, their borders secure. But now, those promises were shattered, and Ukraine was left vulnerable. But the bear underestimated the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Victor, along with his friends and neighbors, rose up to defend their homeland. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, a determination to protect their families and their freedom. Ukraine fights, not because they seek war, but because they refuse to be erased. They show the world that even against impossible odds, a nation can rise. This story is still unfolding, and your understanding matters. To stay informed and support in-depth storytelling, subscribe to Beyond and Back.